Hello and welcome back to class number 2 of moc103, an introduction to Mocha Pro. So in the last class we familiarized ourselves with the basic concepts and interface of Mocha Pro, and we also achieved our first track. So in this class I want to build upon that and introduce you to a couple of more concepts of Mocha, also show you a couple of the obstacles you might face with certain tracks, and this should set us up really well for the following classes. So let's start off by creating a basic X-spline around this cul-de-sac sign. And once I'm finished with that, I'm gonna align the planar surface, not because I want to insert something here, but rather I want us to have a good reference guide to what is actually happening, because what we're gonna set up next is the various translations that are gonna be applied to this shape and the translations that are actually gonna be tracked inside of this shape. So as you can see, by default, we've got translation, scale, rotation, and shearing selected. In the last class, that served us pretty well. But for now, let's explore these one by one. So the first thing I want to mention is that you can't really mix and match these like you want to. For example, if I switch off scale, all the ones below that are switched off as well. So these are in a hierarchy. You can track just the translation, you can track translation and scale, you can track translation, scale and rotation, but they are all dependent on each other. So if you want to try to just track translation and rotation, that will not be possible because Mocha needs the information from the scaling to actually track the rotation. That is due to the fact that any tracking data that is generated by the tracker is actually applied to the shape. That is why the shape transforms as we go along with our track. So let's start by tracking just the translation and take a look what is happening to our shape. So where the tracking itself is fine, this is just the same thing you would get if you would just, for example, perform a 1-point track on a screw or on one of the dots here. But what we still have to say, this being a planar track, it still uses all of the information inside of that shape. So you might still make some use out of something like that for certain stabilization tasks, tracking the whole shape. But as you can see, our planar surface is totally skewed by the end because it doesn't take into account any of the other transformations. So this is just something to keep in mind. A simple translation track will probably not serve you well for any insert work. So let's name this translation only. And next up, I'm gonna set up a new shape. And that one is gonna factor in the scale as well. So we're gonna once again align the planar surface like that. Should give you a good reference on what is happening. And then we'll switch off rotation and shearing. And I'll quickly name this translation. Scale, and let's track that. So by now you can see that this is already an improvement in regards to our first track as the shape gets bigger once the camera gets a little bit closer to the cul-de-sac sign, but still due to the missing rotation and shearing, we're still getting a pretty unusable planar surface in this case. Right, so I'll color this a little bit differently in case we want to compare them later on. So next we've got translation, scaling, and rotation. I'll set that up. Like that. Translation, scale, rotate, colored like so. And let's track away. So now you'll notice that you'll barely see a difference to the version we did before, where we just had the translation and the scale, and you might ask yourself, well, what's the point? And you're rotating with the camera around that sign. Well, you have to think of this like the rotation data you would get from a traditional 2-point track, as this is really just concerning the z-axis. So now we've reached the default settings of moca, and I think you'll see in a bit why they are exactly this, because this from the get-go will be what you want, I think 70 to 80% of the time, that you want these 4 parameters chosen for you. So we've got that aligned, that's great. Quickly name this translation, scale, rotation, shear, like that. I'm gonna color that one yellow. So now you can see we are already getting a much better result. And this is the reason why we used it in the last class to align that logo on the container, because we've got all these shearing going on, and this works really well for us in this case. So we've still got a lot of drift in the end, and maybe we'll see if switching on the perspective option helps us in that regard. So with perspective on, moca is expecting a really rigid planar surface and will try to calculate the perspective changes a lot more, as with the skewing, which is really basically a 2D operations, while perspective really takes into account the rotation on the Y and X axis. So this is the moment where in the last run we really got problems on the upper edge, and while we still got some drift, which is to be expected by such hefty lighting changes, this is already looking much better in this case. So the mesh option is a little bit of a different animal, and we'll explore that with a clip that is a little bit more suitable than this very rigid planar surface like the cul-de-sac sign. So to illustrate to you how the mesh warp works, I thought we'd pick something with a little bit more of an organic movement. And what I want to use as an example is her cheek here, and we want to track that. Now we can try to track that with a normal planar surface, maybe without any perspective switched on, and we will get a decent result. However, there's a lot of movement in the cheek itself because our actress sings and speaks all the time, moves her lips, moves her tongue. So we'll have to find a way to deal with that. And the mesh warp might be a solution for that. So let me show you how that works. So you draw up a shape like you're used to. What you don't want to do this time is add that generous margin that we did in the last class, or at the beginning of this class with the cul-de-sac sign, because additionally to this shape, we're going to apply a mesh, and that mesh will track various points and deform the shape in on itself. So if we switch on the mesh here, you'll see that in action. So by default, moca will place this mesh on areas with high contrast. In this case, it'll look out some of the freckles on her cheek. You can change all that. So you can, for example, change this to a uniform mesh, and you have to generate mesh to update, and then you'll get something like that. However, for our purposes, as we want this mesh to deform the shape we are about to track, we're going to go back to automatic. What you can also change is the mesh size. The smaller the size, the more points you'll get, and your render times will increase. What you can also adjust is the smoothness. That means if you turn this up to 100, you will get a really rigid mesh. And if you turn it down to 0, you'll get a really wobbly, fluent one. So this is just another indication you can give moca on what kind of movement to expect. And then there's this button which says warp spline, and that means if the mesh should actually affect the spline. And you might want to turn this off if you want to keep the shape as much in place as possible and just generate tracking data. If you want to use this for masking, you will want to turn this on. So what the mesh calculates in regards to deformation is actually applied to the shape. So I'll just track that. And I think you can see quite well how moca is calculating in the distortion calculated by the mesh. So the next thing I want us to tackle are occlusions, and this take gives us the perfect opportunity. So let's imagine that you want to track his head, maybe to do an invert stabilize, to do some beauty work on him, or to create a mask, maybe for grading, you name it. So the problem we are facing that at the beginning, his head is quite visible and we should be able to get a good track on him. But once he crosses this guy, then the pool of money here, and then that guy, his head gets clearly obstructed. So we'll have to take a look how we tackle that. So just to illustrate to you why this won't work with the techniques we learned up until now, I'll draw up a very quick X-spline here around his head. I'll leave that little margin like we did in the first class, like so. I'm gonna smooth that out a little bit, and I'm just gonna track away. And we're gonna see that this track really holds up quite nicely. And we continue tracking, it's all fine, right up until he crosses that first guy's head. Then our shape will be skewed, and there, now it's completely lost over to the other guy. That pattern has been obstructed totally. So we'll need to find a way to deal with that. The way to deal with a situation like that is to do a little bit of prep work and actually tell moca which objects to expect, which will occlude your track along the way. And for that, we'll have to set up some occlusion masks. So I'm gonna kill that track. Instead of tracking his head first, I'm actually gonna move the timeline to the moment just before we get our first obstruction here. And I'll set up a shape here around this guy's head. So let's zoom in here. And I'll do the same thing. I will not leave that much of a margin. And also notice that I'll not make this pixel perfect. This is a rough occlusion shape. I want this shape just to be there to tell moca where to expect an occlusion. So I'm gonna set this up, and I'm gonna set an in point for this layer because we really don't need that track before he crosses that guy. So I'm gonna start the layer here, and I'm just gonna track that like so. Pretty easy. I'm gonna stop here and set an out point for that layer, and I can roughly adjust that mask like so. And then I'm gonna step back. I'm gonna name this layer. So this is head 01. And I'm gonna turn off the cogwheel, and I'm also gonna color this so that I'll easily identify this as an occlusion shape. So I'll color this blue and go back in my timeline and do another occlusion shape for his torso. And that one I'll actually start a little bit earlier. This might be a little bit more than we actually need if we just want to track his head. But honestly, in my experience, it proves to be a little bit more generous with these, because once you got a good track going, you might come back and want to produce a rotor for his jacket or whatever. But of course, that's up to you and your schedule, how much work you want to put into this. But I'll very quickly produce another occlusion shape for his torso. Like so. Set up another endpoint and track that. Nice. And I'll continue this process and speed up the recording a little bit and chime in if there's something interesting going on. So see you in a bit. So 3 little things I want to make you really aware of and that you should always pay attention to is firstly, just turn on the cogwheels on the layer you actually want to track, because as you can see, we're accumulating more and more shapes here. So we're with 3 by now, but I can tell you that these will increase in number. And if you keep the cogwheel on all of them, your rendering will really get to start slow. And also, once you did adjustments to your shapes, Mocha will retrack them and probably add things you don't necessarily want in those. So that's something to be aware of. The second thing I want to make you aware of is in close connection to the first one, and that is really constrain the length of these layers to the time where you need them. So for example, this head, I only need it from this frame forward because this is where he starts to obstruct that arm. So I'm going to set my in point here and just track it from that point, like so. And then I'm going back just to the beginning to do his lower arm and hand. I'll do that in one shape. The second thing I find really helpful is constraining these shapes with the in and out points, because that way you don't drag a lot of unused shapes around your setups, and these will only show up in the areas where you actually need them. And of course, the third thing I want to make you aware of is from the get-go, make it a good working practice to name these layers, because as you can see, and as I said, we're accumulating a lot of shapes. And if you start to navigate them by layer names, you'll get confused. So give these descriptive names and you'll be thankful to yourself in the end. What you can, of course, also do is track multiple shapes at once. So for example, I already tracked bits of the torso, and now that the head comes into view, I'm just going to set up another shape for the head. And with both cogs switched on, now both shapes will track from this point forward. And of course, nothing prevents you from tracking from any point in your frame range. So in this example with the last arm, I'm not starting that before he occludes it, but just somewhere in the middle. So I'm going to track a little bit down here. And once that track is done, I can go to the first keyframe and track backwards. And then set up my in and outs after the fact, like that. And like that. So that's our occlusion shapes done. Great. So now that we've got all our occlusion shapes tracked, it's time to track our main actor. So let's get at the beginning of the clip, like that. And just like we did before, we're gonna drag up another shape. Gonna do that exactly the same way as we did before. Leave a little bit of margin. Classic X-spline around his head. Now comes the important bit. Because Mocha has really got no idea of 3D space, we need to tell it to actually anticipate this shape behind the other ones. And the way to do this is this layer hierarchy. This is not arbitrary, because the further down in this list a shape is, the further behind in Z space Mocha expects that shape to be. And while it is not a 3D tracker and has got not an absolute concept of this 3D space, we can help it get a relative understanding of the Z space by a correct layer hierarchy. So what we need to do is just push this one really to the bottom because it's below all the other ones. We can go and figure out a hierarchy for these as well, but honestly, they are all sitting on pretty much the same plane, so it will not make much of a difference for the result. The important thing is that our main track shape is behind those occlusion shapes. So let's quickly track that and see where we land. So now you'll see our occlusion shapes popping up once we set up that endpoint for them. And this works better, but still we get a lot of drift. So let's explore what we can do to make this even better. I'm gonna stop this now because by now it has become pretty much unusable. So let's throw that one away, go back to the beginning and draw up another shape. Up until now, we've just been tracking with Mocha's default settings, and I think it's time we customize them a little bit to our need. So the first thing I want us to switch off is that shear, because his head really doesn't shear at all. He's very linear in his movement, and the only thing we really have is Z rotation, just a little bit the head going up and down. So I'm going to leave rotation on, but I'm going to switch off the shear. The other thing we can adjust is this minimum percentage of pixels used. So right now, Mocha is trying to use 90% of the pixel it finds in this first shape in each other instance. So this will try to give you a very accurate track. However, it can work to your disadvantage if Mocha doesn't find enough pixels. So it's worth playing around with this number. So let's bring this down to something like 50, like that. And don't forget to drag that below in your layer hierarchy once again. And let's start tracking and see if that leads us any better results. So already this is looking much better. Nice. So it sits in there until the very end. That's really, really cool. So another neat way to verify how good your track actually is, beside putting up the planar surface, is to actually stabilize your image in the viewer. You're not performing an actual stabilization that you have to render out. This is just a viewer option, but it's really helpful. So I'm going to zoom in here a little bit and just press this finger. And with that, the active shape will be used to stabilize the picture. So if our track works, his head should stay in place and all the other stuff should be moving around him. And as you can see, that works really well. So one thing to know about this minimum percentage of pixels used is that the predefined number given to you by Mocha here is dependent on its size. So if you draw up a very small shape, let's say we're just gonna use this part of space cap here, then you'll see Mocha suggesting a value of something like 90. If I draw up a very large shape, for example, here on his jacket, like that, then we're getting something like 30 as a suggestion. Mocha is trying to anticipate how many percentages it actually needs to perform a valid track, but this is always something to keep an eye out for and something that can greatly improve your track if you play around with it a little bit and explore it a little bit more. So with that out of the way, let's get to some housekeeping. So we have to properly name our layer. Let's call this hero head track. And then let's just take a very quick look here at the options we've got here. So we've got a fill color. That is something we'll explore in the next class when we'll talk about roto. You've also got the option to lock a shape. If you're really happy with something and fear that you might mess it up accidentally, you can lock that. And another thing, now we've got all these occlusion shapes. So if we want to keep this nice and tidy, we can just put all of those into a folder and name this occlusion. So that way we've got them all in the folder. We can expand that with a plus and minus sign. We can collapse it like that. So that's really neat. The only thing to keep in mind with folders, though, is that the objects included there should be on a similar plane so that you can still make your Z hierarchy work. So that concludes this class. I hope to see you in the next one, where, as I said, we're going to tackle a little bit of roto inside of Mocha. Hope to see you there. Until then, I'm available for you on the FX PhD Slack channel. See you then. So long for now. Bye-bye.